Hello students, let's talk about the early 20th century. Our big essential question that we're going to try and answer by the end of this slide and the end of our reading is this. What major events affected Utahns during the early 20th century? So the very first thing we're going to talk about in this unit is World War I. Maybe you have some background knowledge about World War I. Part of this standard that we'll also cover is going to be about World War II. And what's nice about talking about these things is that we live in a time where we have a lot of exposure to those two events. And I'm thinking specifically about like our connection to video games and how we see that. Make sure you're paying attention to these slides so we can get our accurate information, but also think about your background knowledge and use that too. Let that help you as we move forward. So World War I was started by German submarines. They're known as U-boats. They fired torpedoes at American ships in the Atlantic Ocean. It was a big no-no for a lot of American people. It made them very upset. And you can see in this newspaper down here, war declared, right? I know that our focus is going to be on Utah studies. So that's where we're going to try and make this connection too. So Germany is now going to be seen as the enemy. War is declared by President Wilson in 1917. A lot of Utahns are going to send their fathers, brothers, nephews, cousins, sons over to Germany to fight. So that's one of the ways that Utah is connected in this war. Another way is that those miners that we've been focused on for a couple of modules are going to help with war efforts. So what you're looking at over here is a picture of a mine. I know it's black and white and kind of difficult to see, but when you mine for raw materials like lead, copper, zinc, silver, you eventually can mold those and turn them into weapons that you'll need to fight in wars. So you may have heard of Kennecott Copper. It was once known as the Utah Copper Company. Produced copper and minerals for guns and ammunition. Another major thing is that during wartime, your soldiers have to eat. So a lot of wheat is needed. And if you can remember back to our first unit for our class, the Great Basin has really great flat land, perfect for what? You guessed it, farming. So many people go to volunteer and help farm a lot of wheat, which will feed the troops. In fact, Utah women stored about 200,000 bushels of wheat to help. Very impressive. So let's check back in with our essential question. How were Utahns affected by the events of World War I? So we just talked about that wheat that was needed. We talked about the mines that were needed. And this is someone named Maud Finch, or Fitch. She was a Utah woman who decided to pay her own way over to Germany, buy her own ambulance because she knew how to drive an ambulance and she had some medical background and she was able to help wounded soldiers over there during the war. War ended November 18th, 1918. Okay, pay attention to this year. That's going to be very important. Utah celebrates the end of the war, and you can pause yours and read this quote by Will Jones. Basically, what he's describing is what you see here in this picture. Everyone was really excited that war was ending. Let's talk about some of the events of the war. So here we have a picture of a bunch of soldiers in something called a trench. What they would do is they would dig down into the earth and they would create some type of shelter so they weren't directly in the line of fire. There were different types of trenches. This one has enough room for you to sit and it's pretty narrow. And you've got some sort of medical person here examining the feet of these soldiers. I want you to think about what would happen if you were in this trench when it rained, or what would happen if your clothing or your socks or your shoes were muddy or wet and you couldn't just leave to go take your shower and put on dry clothes because you're on a battlefield. Think about the long-term effects of that. If you want, you can study something called trench foot, which was a really common thing happening at this time. Soldiers were very concerned about hygiene. They were in really tight spaces together. They were close. They weren't getting enough sleep. They weren't getting the nutrition that they needed. They were very stressed. There were a lot of negative things happening to the health of these soldiers. So now we get to talk about something that is going to sound very familiar. Never before when I have taught this have I ever been able to teach to a group of students who can relate more to this now than ever before. So you guys are a pretty unique breed here. Our next topic is number 2, the Spanish flu. Sometimes you'll hear it called the Spanish influenza, but we shorten it to flu. More soldiers, pay attention to this fact, more soldiers in Europe died as a result of the influenza virus than in battle. So we have some pictures up here of hospital beds full of sick people, rows and rows and rows of people suffering from this sickness. We've got another group of ambulance workers and paramedics with stretchers ready to carry those sick people where they need to go. At the time, there was no medicine to help cure the disease. Does that start to sound kind of familiar? Utah health workers decide to ban all public gatherings. Is that sounding familiar as well? They ban things like church and schools. Now, normally in the past when I tell my students, they think, oh, no way. How awesome would it be to ban school? And now you guys can really relate to a part of history. What do you think about it? They decide to shorten business hours. Stores stopped special sales because they're not trying to bring in a bunch of people. They're trying to keep people safe. Funeral services were shortened to only 15 minutes. I've got some pictures here that might help us connect or relate to events happening in 1918. We've got a group of people. This picture was taken outside of Brigham Young University. Here they are covering their faces with some masks because they don't want to share those diseases. Now we could even add some more knowledge from 2020 and maybe tell these people in the past, take a few feet apart, maybe 6 feet apart, right? Try not to touch other people, social distancing. Here we have this voluntary flu ban, gym classes stop, schools are closed, churches are closed, funeral ban, the library is closed. Death brings warning of influenza, dances are banned, etc. Here we have a group of people, and at the time, the medical knowledge was not what it is now. You can see that they're wearing masks incorrectly. They didn't really know what worked and what didn't work. And I'll send you some slides, and you can look through more pictures and political cartoons and graphs to see how the Spanish influenza impacted these people. And it wasn't just something that was happening in Europe. This happened, remember, right after World War I. So a lot of those soldiers are in those trenches getting sick. They get on the boat to travel back home after the war. They're still not feeling well. They interact with their family and friends, and just like that, disease spreads so quickly. Okay, we will revisit this information in another video, but for now, that's what you need to know about the early 20th century.